coming out tonight. We're very excited to have Austyn, Wohlers, and Benjamin Crais to celebrate the launch of Austyn's debut novel. Before we get started, I just want to point out a few logistics for how tonight's event is going to go. We're going to be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A after they have a little bit of a discussion, so you can start thinking of some questions. And then after the talk tonight, Austyn's going to be signing close to where y'all checked in, and I can show you where that is at the end of the event. And if you're joining us on the YouTube live stream, please buy a copy of Hothouse Bloom in the link in the description box below. All right. Hothouse Bloom follows a young woman who renounces her painting career and all of her human relationships to become one with her late grandfather's apple orchard. The novel is a millennial pastoral, both painterly and critical in its ideas about art, permaculture, subjectivity, and the natural world. Austyn Wohlers was born in Atlanta in 1996, and her other writing has appeared in The Baffler, the Massachusetts Review, Guernica, and elsewhere. She's also a musician, releasing music alone and with the band Tomato Flower. Hothouse Bloom is her first book. Benjamin Crais is a scholar, critic, and film programmer based in New York City. All right, y'all, without any further ado, please join me in giving Austyn and Benjamin a very warm welcome.
I don't know why I just waved. Okay. I'm going to read just from the beginning of chapter 9. It was almost July. It was time to work, and Anna readied herself for the transference from the pastoral to the Georgic she had foreseen in the gazebo. But before she could bring Jan into the orchard, it was imperative to conform to the psychic nature of the place. So in the middle of the night, she was sure he was asleep, she rose from her bed, went past the dog sleeping on the yellow porch, past the bamboo grove in the summer garden, past the half-built pond near the duck run and out into the apple field, above which the stars were reflected in the night sky, as though a star had formed within each apple bud and floated up to burn. Yes, night remained the time for thinking. That's what the orchard was saying to her, and squinting she felt as though she could draw vapor tendrils of the pink scents of fruit up into the lights of each star. She walked slowly in the darkness, running her hands along the shadowy branches, inhabiting things. That was what she saw. How long since she'd really gotten here? She emptied herself. She paused with one bare foot above the grass. She completed the step. Dozens of blades parted on her soul, her apple garden, the light dark hot of nights, the mirroring. Then she stood still in the apple grove, absent-mindedly rubbing a leaf between her thumb and her forefinger. It had rained and the leaf was wet. She imagined if it had kept raining, overflowing. The ducks swimming in the wet soil coagulating into mud, the apples mutating into mangroves, the farm lightly submerged, the farm becoming a floodplain good for rice and cranberries with the rain coming down abruptly as though heaven tossed in giant handfuls. And the water eating everything, mixing with the roots and the trees and the grasses, mixing with her body and Jan's and everything else's. That's what she hoped things would be like. And even if the way things were going between her and Jan was still forming, and she loved that word, things, so malleable, even if they were figuring out exactly what things would look like between them, how their friendship would revive and transmute itself. After a submergence like that, the two of them would have no choice but to sink into the grass, attach their feet to the root systems, and share in the nutrients of all those apple trees. Together, the thousands of them. Then he'd understand. Jan's window lit up. She froze as though it were a floodlight. She saw his black silhouette in the yellow window. She squinted, but she couldn't tell if he was looking out at the summer darkness or opening up his laptop to work. She returned to the cabin and went to sleep. When she began to take him out into the orchard, she figured she would start him off easy. After breakfast one morning, they went out to prune. Since the springtime, the diamond-pink blossoms of the trees had fallen and dusted the dry ground like tinted snow, and now the fetal apples were thinking of burgeoning, the red spheres slowly revealing themselves from within their green cocoons, blending oddly with them, like green skin grafted onto red sclera. In the daylight, Anna could see them in all their horror. No veil of soft night. The lower branches were stiff, and the apples were unfolding in clusters, while the flower buds curled up hard as rocks, petalless. And on the ground, the unripe windfall looked like an evisceration. Together, they trimmed the younger aphid-lated branches so the fruit-bearing spurs could access light. Anna reached up with a gigantic red pruner on top of her ladder, watching the limbs fall to the ground. Then the sun settled on the branch like an incubator while the apples formed like eggs. And with their thick green coats of leaves, each apple looked so colossal, so much taller than a person, and with so many lives: worms, squirrels, butterflies, ants, aphids, bees, birds, spiders. Within it, that to work at its side was like examining an enormous breathing animal. And there were hundreds of them, hundreds of red and green animals, rhinos, elephants, standing perfectly still in rows on the slope with its carpet of bushes, ferns, and flowers. But was it the same for Jan? For long stretches of time, they were silent together, and Anna couldn't think of anything besides whether or not Jan was experiencing the same divine contact, and couldn't feel anything but the frustration of having her own contact blocked by his presence. Because although she had tried to close her eyes and sink into the apple trees as she had done so often, even as they were growing unfamiliar to her, to access that feeling beyond the verbal, to purely feel what the trunks would feel, to understand the birds warbling in their own language, her thoughts were blocked like a river by a rock. And how to get around it? She snipped off a water sprout. Even standing on the ladder across from him, separated by the body of an apple tree, it was like he could see into her thoughts. I'll stop there.
All right, let's begin our conversation. Austyn and I have been friends for a decade at this point.
Yeah.
So I feel like I've been in a privileged position to watch and occasionally read as this has kind of taken shape from, I think, first a short story in a class, and then the honors thesis project in undergrad, then MFA thesis, and then finally as the novel that we're holding in our hands. And so I thought, kind of as a first question, having kind of seen you work on this on and off for basically a decade, and then, to now, like, I don't know, what has it been like to kind of, go through your 20s, kind of working on this book, and how does it feel to, to be here now?
Yeah, I feel pretty weird, but I feel good. It's been crazy. I think that for so long it was like really the only thing I cared about, and everything else that was happening felt like sort of like external to my life. But now I feel like much more less precious about it, I guess. Which I think is pretty standard. Anytime you put out a piece of art, by the time it comes out, you're kind of onto something else. But I definitely saw the book like grow and change as I grew and change. I knew from the beginning that I wanted to write a critique of the pastoral, but the original short story was a lot more surreal and really just about her friendship with Jan, and didn't have the kind of like anti-capitalist like critique of property element that comes in later with the book. It just sort of failed as like a horror story basically, and like the decay of the trees was really supernatural and not really material. And then I think, as I started like hanging out with you and like reading Marx and stuff, I was like maybe like able to find like language and like an actual, maybe like a grounded political critique that wasn't just, this sort of like abstract decline. But it's always been a tragedy. You remember from the short story, I think I'm really interested in tragedy and art, and life's so tough. Like one of the things we can do is like commiserate, I guess. And I think I really like to read a book and like feel another's pain, I guess. And it's like not a standard tragedy. Like we were talking a bit in the green room earlier. But in an original draft, she died at the end, and Jan finds her body, and like a perspective shift, kind of like Things Fell Apart by Chinua Achebe. And that doesn't happen now, and I won't spoil it, but it's like a kind of death at the end. I think it's worse than death, actually, what happens at the end.
Does it feel like from that first short story to now, does it feel like you've been following like the same vision or kind of like one instinct or something like that? Or has it been a moment where you felt like what you thought you were working on totally was reconceptualized for you?
It definitely changed. Like, again, it was much more about like just the dynamic between the two people and not so much the exterior world at the beginning. And yeah, again, sort of with growing political awareness, that aspect of it took form. But I would say in general, I've been really stubborn with this book. Like, a lot of people didn't like it. And like I had a professor tell me it was like I didn't understand the basics of fiction. And I think about the short story. And I think I kind of like saw it through to the end out of spite. I was like, I'm gonna make it work. And so like the germ of it is still the same. Like the first like 500 words or so are like pretty much unchanged from the first draft of the novel, not the short story. But I think there's even language from the short story still in there.
And the title has been the same,
Yeah.
like the entire time. Right?
Yeah, the title, it came up in Uma Narayan's book, Dislocating Cultures, that I was working at the time, and then I saw it again in Faulkner. And a hothouse bloom is like a very fragile person who can't handle the world. It's like the phrase.
And to go, what you said about it being a critique of the pastoral, like, I don't know if this is your language or not, right? But in the press copy for the book, like in the first sentence, it says like a millennial pastoral, which is kind of interesting for two reasons. I thought we could like talk about that phrase. I mean, because like millennial at one, like one of the things we did like 5 years ago is Austyn and I were in I looked up the email thread. It was called Permaculture/Commune Reading Group, where we were reading like stuff about the history of agriculture and things like that.
And we read the history of world agriculture. It was
yeah,
yeah,
exactly. So like, I'm curious, like, I don't know, why write a critique of the pastoral today? Like, especially for a genre that I think for a long time was kind of associated with, the English countryside and kind of much earlier moment in capitalism.
Well, I think the dream has really revived itself. I think everybody has like an out in their head where they're going to go raise sheep in the countryside if whatever doesn't work out. And I think it's a really attractive dream. But, that kind of production often isn't pretty and like comes at like a very human cost. And I think that on like a maybe more personal note, I've always sort of maybe wanted to have, escape routes and options. Like I think that there's a lot of, language around like failure in this book, and I was really scared for a long time of like failing, whatever that meant, in various ways. And had that dream too. And I mean, like you see like Harvest Moon, Stardew Valley, like people love that stuff. But but I don't, I don't think that like retreating from the world's problems like that is the answer, and is often like part of the problem.
There's something interesting too with the main character, right, where you can imagine this being about starting, say, like a commune, as I think is briefly suggested. She briefly suggests much later in the book, right? But she's really driven by this like single-minded fixation on like decreating herself or becoming totally impersonal or kind of annihilating her subjectivity in certain ways.
Totally.
Why that is kind of the driving obsession of the book.
Yeah. Maybe also kind of tying back to the failure thing. I think also like it's interesting. Some of the reviews have mentioned this, that there's a lot of, maybe you could say, Christian imagery in the book. Like it's an apple tree, there's sheep. It's like an Eden story. I don't know. But I don't come from a Christian background at all. My mom was like pretty psychedelic, and kind of new age. And so I got a lot more kind of like Buddhist influence. And I think the sort of like enlightenment through like self-annihilation or nothingness, or like her like constant focus on the nothingness kind of comes down to that.
Yeah. One of the things I find kind of compelling about her as a protagonist and about the book is that both her kind of driving impulse is this kind of annihilation for subjectivity, this kind of wish to become whole with nature, or she uses language like fusion or merge and things like that. But the book is also like really committed until these kind of perspective shifts in the very last quarter, kind of to just being like kind of totally within her subjectivity, where you kind of like, even though she wants to escape it, reading the book sometimes feel like you're like trapped in this like monadic subjectivity that people are like knocking on the glass and like, totally. Not getting through.
Yeah.
And like, I wonder if that was a challenge to write like a character like this who like so desperately wants to not be a character.
Yeah, totally. I mean, a huge critique I get for it often is that you don't know anything about her. But I've always been interested in literature where characters kind of step out of the void. And I think I wanted maybe the reality or like phenomenology of the book to feel like what she was trying to do, which was to like completely annihilate any trace of her past and just be this person wandering. And you only get like aspects of her history and past kind of slowly as other characters come into play. And there's that scene with her mom where she's like showing at her mom and stuff like that. I think that the perspective shifts are interesting because it originally sort of came from that idea of having her die, and then it switched to Jan's perspective at the end. Another book that does that really well is The Glass Bead Game by Herman Hesse. Where it's like a 600-page novel, and then at the end he like suddenly drowns, and you get like the perspective of his student. But even with removing the death, I think the perspective shifts were interesting, just in sort of, I think they really highlight how kind of far gone she is, and like maybe bring a element of the book that's about like mental illness, like because you're with her and you're like so with her for so much of it, and then seeing, you know, these sort of like more grounded characters sort of be like, you know, she's not eating well and like shit like this. I hope I'm allowed to swear. Is uh yeah, I think like brought a lot of life into that last half, and like I think there have been some critiques that it like kind of like deflated the intensity, but I think the deflation of the intensity was sort of the point of it, and you know, is kind of related to the tragedy of the book, like because her dream fails, you know, like she's not actually able to maintain that intensity.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of baffled by that comment in the review you're mentioning, because I think that's what kind of brought the book, like made the book click for me. That shift.
Yeah, totally.
Right. I mean, also to go back to the pastoral thing, like part of the critique, if you want to frame it this way, it seems like is about how she envisions nature. Right. She has this kind of real emphasis on like immediacy and how she wants to just experience things and doesn't understand their history and things like that. And I'm just kind of curious about, like, knowing you kind of more broadly, you've always been really attracted to like going hiking and kind of natural themes and things like that. I'm just wondering, like, I don't know, what were you trying to like think about with these kind of painterly depictions of nature in this book? Because I mean, the main character is formerly a painter. There's this kind of real through line about how do you conceptualize or kind of perceive nature, and you get kind of
totally.
Gary's perspectives on that.
Yeah, part of it is through Anna's like kind of new project, which would be to try to like live in some like artistic way that didn't involve like the production of art. And tied to that sort of drive for like immediate experience, I think. There was a part at the beginning I wanted to touch on, what you said. I'm kind of blanking. I think that like, I don't know, I think it like ties into, the nature stuff. Yeah. I think that like, maybe it ties into like some fear I've always had about myself. You know, I have a really good brain for facts. And I feel like I'm always forgetting the history of things. I can never remember like the names of directors. But I think that's sort of how I experience the world in part. And not always in like a totally like not self-reflective way. The nature stuff, yeah, I do like hiking. I guess that's what I wanted to say.
When I was rereading, I was just struck by this moment where she's like, I want to restore the untouchedness of the nature. And there's also the line where someone is like, oh, didn't the orchard used to be a factory before?
Totally.
And
yeah.
like,
yeah, for sure. And yeah, that could be a self-crit too. I don't know. You know, I'm so attracted to beauty, but I'm also a Marxist, so you know, it's the war. But I think, yeah.
I mean, to go back to these kind of aesthetics of nature and stuff. I mean, like, you're also a musician who's interested in like psychedelia and ambient music, and I think like or you put me on to like Gas, and I was thinking a lot about that music when I was reading this book.
Yeah.
And I guess like if you could talk a bit about how like I think I know the kind of literary influences that have kind of informed this book, and those are the ones that are usually referenced in the reviews that have come out so far.
Totally.
But I wonder if you could talk about how these like ambient music in a way like this book seems very close to what you try to do with your music there.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's very textural in the same way. The Gas album art and the Koningsforst art book, which came out in like 2016, are definitely inspirations for like Anna's zoomed in paintings of nature. Like I was definitely thinking of those covers. I think I started listening and like kind of getting into more abstract music to write, you know, because you can't really write to stuff with lyrics if you're not good at multitasking. Then I just got into ambient music, and so like by the and I was also finding it too interesting to really write to. So by the end, pretty much every day I was listening to this track by Jeffrey Cantu the Desma called Bloodstream Sermon, which is like changes like 2 chords in an hour. Like it's just like it's just drone, but it's really beautiful. And also his album Love Is a Dream with Sela, which is like kind of more of a noise album, but like kind of like effervescent enough to just feel like white noise. But I think I was trying to make some ambient music at the time, but yeah, a lot of it's really written through that fog, for sure.
And with the main character kind of constantly sitting on the verge of like dissolving into the
Yeah,
environment
totally.
or something. Like even the way you describe the orchard or something like that, it reminds me of some of that music.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I think Wolfgang Voigt was like, I wanted to bring the forest to techno, or like techno to the forest. And that kind of feels like this book a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I also wanted to maybe talk about like, I don't know what the phrase would be, like let's say gender in the book, right? Because like the way you've talked about the book and how the book kind of invites you to read it is in part about how this character Anna is kind of comes to become a kind of agrarian capitalist in a way, right?
Yeah,
and her
totally.
relationship with these various men who are working on the farm is one of like, boss and her laborers, right? A lot of her kind of moving from this kind of early pastoral fantasy into kind of the reality of having to make a profit to sustain the orchard and things like that. But it's also notable, right, that all the people who work on the farm and who kind of live there, besides her neighbors, right, are all men. And as she kind of grows more isolated into her role as a boss, vis-a-vis her friend Jan who's visiting, but also the two men who are working there, there's also something like very gendered in that isolation she feels from them. There's these scenes of her like coming across and having this kind of homosocial bonding, and then what precipitates a major event at the end of the book that I guess I won't spoil, but she's a line of being like, he acted so grossly like a man.
Yeah, totally.
I wonder if you could just kind of talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. There are all sorts of powers at play in their dynamic, especially just amongst the different sort of types of laborers they are. Like one of them is like an immigrant farmhand with a lot of experience. One of them is like Jan, who's just like a writer visiting, and one of them is like a college kid woofing, basically. And you can see their various levels of like expertise and like power or like lack of power, I think, really play out in their dynamics. But yeah, you're right, the language changes at a point where she just starts saying like the men at a certain point. I think that there's definitely an element of it that is about like, I think one of the things that Anna's trying to escape from is freedom from, like gendered performance, but it's also just like human performance. I think I've been resistant to like extremely like feminist maybe interpretations of the book, just because it feels maybe more kind of totalizing, but it's definitely there. And there's like the kind of like tension with Jan that like never really fully gets resolved.
And the drawing of
and the drawing of her
bosom exaggerated.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, they do some drawings. I in an earlier draft I had tried to draw it and like I had it like in the book, and my professor was just like, "What is this?" And then I took it out. It would have been cool to keep it. It's like Faulkner's eye,
Do you have it somewhere?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'll show you. Yeah, but yeah, no, I think it ultimately for me is subsumed into the like freedom from humanity in general thing, but like freedom from gender is one thing that she attempts and sort of fails at too.
Because there's also kind of a historical association of like femininity and nature.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, something we talked about.
She's on her moon goddess ship.
For sure. For real, yeah. There's also like, I don't know how far we can go with this, and we were talking about it earlier, but reading it again for this event, I was struck by how much the language of her wanting to fuse with the forest, fuse with nature. There's like, you can read it as a kind of womb fantasy.
Yeah,
in a way.
totally.
There's something where the only non
we're gonna do a
Freudian.
Yeah, Freudian reading.
Yeah. There's the only only character who's not based in the immediate setting of the book is her mom, that she has a kind of a strange relationship.
Yeah,
from.
totally.
You can tell you read
No, all the family stuff is whack. Yeah.
And I would have to ask about the epigraph.
Oh yeah.
So the book has an epigraph from the communist philosopher Jacques Camat, who also is kind of sometimes discussed as the father of kind of what do you call it, like anti-civ politics.
Yeah, anti-civ. Yeah, totally.
In a way, right? And I know because we're friends, right? That it was a pretty late addition to the book. I mean, I think like after the arcs had gone out, so really just like it's only in this hardcover that we have here. Could you talk about the choice of like wanting to have that being the first thing the reader encounters.
Yeah, totally. And we should read it so they know. It's a quote from Kamat. Here it is not a question of death as the extinction of life, but of death and life. Death with all the substance and power of life. The human being is dead and no more than a ritual of capital. I think I liked this quote in part because it sort of spoke to what she's trying to do, like phenomenologically, like the self-annihilation in order to experience like ultimate life sort of thing. But then also, I think the human being is dead and no more than a ritual of capital. Sort of, I mean, that's sort of a summary of the book almost. Is like her attempts to live getting subsumed by like having to participate in capitalist economics. And I think I wanted to have that quote there also to kind of color the reading of the book a bit because, you know, it does have that kind of late stage critique in it. But I think if you just flip through the first half, it would just read like a Thoreau fantasy kind of. So yeah, that was a really deliberate choice to kind of like maybe color the first half of the book in a different light.
Because it's been striking to me that maybe in part because maybe they just got the arcs. It's been striking to me that some of the reviews of the book, which are incredibly glowing, seem to kind of miss that
Yeah.
shift in the book.
Well, and it's like everybody wants to give their reading and talk about certain aspects of it.
Yeah.
You know, plenty of picked up on it too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you want to talk a bit about it seems like the next book that you're working on right now is trying to be even more kind of pointedly political.
Yeah.
The early draft I read.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's the elevator pitches. It's about an alcoholic ex-sculptor who is seduced into working on a Christo-fascist land art project that is actually a prison complex at the end. So it starts off sort of this like kind of realistic erotic thriller, and then by the end it's on some like paranoid Delillo thing. And that's been really fun. It reads really different from Hothouse Bloom. It's a lot plottier.